What's up guys, DXDoth here, and today we are taking a look at a new Hunter build. I've been theory crafting around a little bit after the recent patch with Executioner's change, and I felt that a few things about the standard build weren't really making the most possible use out of items and what those items provide you with. So without further ado, I present you a new build, and as builds always have to have names in Smite, I will name it the Sloth. It's actually quite fitting because the stats in that build kind of reflect that. We'll get into that. So, as usual, as with every build, you want to start with a Golden Bow. Golden Bow is just too strong at the moment to pass up on. You could say it's OP, I would say it's OP, but you definitely have to build it. After that, you already have to make the first decision. In this scenario, we will go with Soul Eater next. If you have a high power dependent hunter, you can swap that out with the next item we get into in a second. But Soul Eater should be fine in most scenarios because you get the extra attack speed in combination with the power from Golden Bow. And while this is not the perfect number of early DPS, especially when you're dependent on ability clear, it allows you to get sustain earlier than your enemy, and it doesn't put you behind as much in the early stage. We get into the power curve later as well. When you're done Soul Eater, you want to try and stack it as fast as possible, simply because it provides you with extra movement speed. By the time it's fully stacked, you're basically on the same level as someone who would have boots without the Golden Bow. After that, we're going into an item that you have probably not seen on Hunters all too often. It's been a little bit neglected so far, but it's actually really good in this very build. The item I'm talking about is Masamune. Masamune is a very good item now simply because it provides you with movement speed, base movement speed that doesn't have to be stacked. It has a high amount of power on the item, and it has an additional passive against high health targets. This means that the item has a certain synergy with items we get into later, basically making it equal to kin size when it used to not be in other builds. After that, the order is once again a bit situational. We'll just assume in this scenario that the enemy has already built some defense and go with Executioner next, also because it's the cheapest item in the build at that point. After that, if you didn't build it first, you go Wind Demon. If the enemy team is completely squishy, then you can try to get Wind Demon first. Like I said, it's a bit more expensive, so it's not always recommended. Then you go Deathbringer and are now 6 slotted. At this point, the build already outclasses pretty much every other build in terms of DPS, and you will have a decent amount of movement speed. You have Golden Bow and Masamune to supply you with base movement speed that is still above what a normal boot build would provide you with just boots, and you have the additional movement speed from Soul Eater on top of that. Now, to actually get to the highest DPS power spike possible, you go for Malice instead of Golden Bow. What this does is it gives you triple crit, so your crit chance is extremely high. You have Executioner on top of that to remove protections, and at the same time, you're not lacking lifesteal as you would in some other builds. The problem that comes up in this scenario and the situation is that you will have to have stacks on Soul Eater. With Masamune alone, you still have 10% movement speed, but it's not quite as much as boots, especially when the other builds have so much extra movement speed, so you want to try and keep Soul Eater stacked at all times in order to maintain the movement speed. So this is generally not a build you want to build when behind. We look into this a little further right here, where you see the comparison between 3 builds that one could do. We have the standard build, the Sloth, and a build that I would just call the Bloodforge build now. Comparing the price difference, you'll see that on the second item, you'll struggle a bit in the Sloth build, simply because it's 450 gold more, so you have to wait quite a bit more in order to get your build going in that place, or even more if you get Masamune. So that's when the enemy has a power spike over you, and you have to be careful at that point. As you can also see, I've put levels above, so you have an average idea of around which level these items are built. For the comparison's sake, I've put one item of each build on the same level, so the DPS numbers look similar. Realistically, you will probably finish Soul Eater in the Sloth build around level 9 or 10 and not 8, but it would skew the numbers in terms of DPS and make it look better than it actually is. So I figured I'd do it this way. You'll just have to understand that in the early levels, the standard build comes online a little quicker, and it kind of equals out around level 15, where the price difference is only 200 gold. However, after that, if you get to level 18 and you get that build online so far, the Sloth will outclass the standard build. And it will continue to do so till the end of the game, till the full build. If you take the Bloodforge build in comparison, which I haven't done all the calculations for again because it was a little bit annoying with the levels, you will see that even the Bloodforge build, which is a very expensive build with a much worse power curve, will have less DPS in the end. These calculations are done against an Agni with no defense items, so this is against a very squishy target. And as you can see in the Bloodforge build, you have this certain price spike the moment you will Bloodforge. And you want to build Bloodforge at some point because it's your only lifesteal item, but you can't really build it early because it's too expensive. And the later you build it, the more of a problem it is because the enemy hunter will just outsustain you in lane. So overall, while the Bloodforge build will provide you with nearly the same amount of damage, or DPS, the Sloth build will be superior in regards to the power curve. However, once again, the Bloodforge build has boots at the end, while the Sloth build does not. And you could theoretically turn a standard build into a Bloodforge build late game if you wanted to, by trading out Soul Eater for Bloodforge, but then again, it would be more costly overall because you would trade out 2 items. As you can see in the standard build, you have to trade out a Golden Bow for either Malice or Executioner, but in both scenarios, it has less DPS than a Sloth build by quite a fair margin, at least 50 DPS. And it also requires you to trade on an additional item if you want to go for Ninja Tabi instead of Warrior Tabi, because if you build Ninja Tabi right away, then the DPS of the standard build is already lower early on. This is done on Ram, it's a little different on other characters, but overall it stays the same. Early on, power reigns supreme over attack speed, and later on attack speed becomes better. But the more you invest into late game, the more effective the Sloth build becomes in comparison. So the standard build, in the way it is set up right now, gives you the highest amount of power that it could possibly do. Now, looking at these stats, the builds are not too different yet. You have the advantage of the heavy crits, of the triple crit, that you get relatively early in the Sloth build, and the high damage without the crit as well, just from the high power you have. But overall, the DPS doesn't really sound like it's worth the trade, in my opinion. We're looking at some other stats now. We'll look at the DPS against a Ymir with a tanky build, Reinforced Greaves, Sovereignty, Height of the Urchin, Winged Blade, Pestilence, and Megardian Mail. Here you can see that the difference is already decent once again, but not crazy. We have the standard build where you get 455 DPS with Executioner, but if you go Malice in this case, your DPS drops down. You have to choose between one of the two, different from the Sloth or the Bloodforge build. And in both scenarios, you lose DPS against one target or another. If you go with a heavy crit build, you're probably better against the squishies, but then you lose out on a lot of DPS against tanky targets. With the Bloodforge build or the Sloth build, you will have both. And now for the most extreme difference, which I find the most interesting, and which is the reason why I think this build has a place. If you look at an Agni with level 20 and only Warlock Sash as a defense item, so a high health, low defense build, and then the difference between the builds becomes extremely significant. You would think that the Concise build would actually be better, but they're not. The Concise build, the standard build, goes around 750 DPS, both with Execution and Malice. The Bloodforge build reaches nearly 800, and the Sloth build, because it includes Masamune, goes up to 870 DPS, which is quite a significant difference once again. Keep in mind that in late game it might not matter that much because it's against a squishy, but if a squishy has a lot of health, then DPS can be significant. The reason why I think Masamune is so good here is because the passive kinda works with crit as far as I know. Because of that, any extra damage you get gets multiplied by crit on top of everything else, increasing your DPS quite significantly. So overall, the Sloth build will out-DPS the other builds around level, well, maybe 15 to 18, depending on the situation, depending on how far you are with the build. And what's important is you will have to keep your Soul Eater stacked if you want to trade out Golden Bow late game. You can do without and you will still have higher DPS, but it's a bit more risky because you don't have the same movement speed as you would otherwise. And this build is much better when you're ahead. If you get that first blood and you get that little bit of bonus gold, then it's much more accessible, and as soon as you do, you will probably always have an advantage over your enemy, because from the power curve you get the early power, same as this normal build, Then you have sustain before the enemy has. Then you have yet another high power spike that also helps against tanky targets if there are any early on, which is good in lane if you against a Guardian who just finished his first defense item. Then you get relatively early protection shred. You can switch that out on the normal build as well and build executioner early, but it's typically not ideal and will lower your DPS in comparison. And then you also have relatively early crit, while some other builds, for example the Bloodforge build, achieves crit later than that. Quick, too long didn't watch summary. The Sloth build is very strong if you get ahead early, and it will out DPS every other build in every scenario at some point of the game. However, it is much better when the enemy is building health to some extent, which a lot of players do though. If you look at the graphs here now, you can see that the DPS difference between both the Standard and the Sloth build are not really that huge for the majority of the game. Looking at the curves, the blue curve is the Standard build and the red curve is the Sloth build. Most of the time they're really close to each other. The Standard build has a power curve in between. This is based on the gold you have and not the levels, or the gold you spend on items and not the levels. But in the end, the Sloth build takes over the Standard build. Why I'm naming this build the Sloth is because it has relatively slow movement speed, and the attack speed is also not the highest. Hunters that have a lot of base attack speed or scaling attack speed benefit from it a lot more than those who don't, especially those with steroids can do very well with it because the build itself has a lot of power and not as much attack speed. The real question is if you dare to trade out your boots and if you want to go triple crit late game. You can avoid going triple crit and just leave a golden bow in your build and it would still be fine, but for the highest DPS you want to go triple crit in this scenario. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Duke Sloth out.